The steel door of cell block D slammed shut with the same bone-rattling finality it produced every night for the past 7 years. But on this particular December evening in 2019, Marcus Johnson barely noticed a sound that had once filled him with rage and despair. Instead, he sat on the edge of his narrow bunk, carefully examining the small collection of materials he had managed to accumulate over the past 3 weeks. Colored pencils worn down to stubs, sheets of paper salvaged from the law library, thread pulled from an old towel, and scraps of fabric obtained through trades with other inmates. To most people, these items would look like prison junk, the kind of improvised crafting supplies that correctional officers typically confiscated during cell searches. But to Marcus, they represented something far more significant. The raw materials for what he hoped would become the most meaningful Christmas that Riverside State Penitentiary had seen in its 47-year history. Marcus Johnson was not the kind of man anyone would have expected to orchestrate a Christmas miracle. At 42 years old, he was serving year 7 of a 15-year sentence for armed robbery, a conviction that had resulted from a desperate attempt to pay for his daughter's cancer treatments after losing his job and health insurance. The crime had been clumsy and ultimately unsuccessful, but had earned him a lengthy sentence in one of the state's most notoriously violent correctional facilities. Riverside State Penitentiary housed nearly 3,000 inmates across 6 cell blocks, each with its own hierarchical structure of violence, intimidation, and survival. Cell Block D, where Marcus had spent most of his incarceration, was reserved for inmates with histories of violence or disciplinary problems. The concrete corridors echoed with the constant sounds of shouting, arguments, and the metallic clanging of doors and gates that never seemed to stop. For his first 6 years at Riverside, Marcus had been exactly what the system expected him to become: angry, bitter, and focused solely on surviving until his release date. He had learned the unwritten rules of prison life: which gangs control which territories, how to trade for necessities, when to fight, and when to avoid confrontation. He had accumulated a share of disciplinary infractions, spending months in solitary confinement for fights that had erupted over perceived disrespect or competition for limited resources. But something had begun to change in Marcus during the spring of 2019, a shift that started with a letter from his daughter Keisha, now 15 years old and cancer-free thanks to treatments that had bankrupted the family and ultimately led to Marcus's desperate decision to rob a convenience store. "Dad," Keisha had written in her careful teenage handwriting, "I know you're angry about being locked up, and I know you did what you did to help me. But I don't want your sacrifice to be wasted. I want you to come home as someone I can be proud of, not someone who's just survived prison. Can you try to be the man you were before everything went wrong?" The letter had hit Marcus harder than any punch he had taken in prison fights, any disciplinary action from the guards, or any denial from the parole board. His daughter was asking him to reclaim the person he had been before desperation, and circumstances had turned him into a criminal. The man who had coached Little League baseball, who had read bedtime stories, who had taught her to ride a bicycle and helped her with homework. That man seemed like a stranger to Marcus now, buried under years of institutional hardening and the psychological armor necessary to survive in a place where showing weakness could be fatal. But Keisha's letter planted a seed of possibility that maybe redemption was still available to him, even in the most unlikely place. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For months, Marcus struggled with the gap between who he wanted to become and who he had learned to be in prison. He started small, avoiding unnecessary conflicts, spending more time in the library, volunteering for the few programs available to inmates in a security classification. He began reading books about personal development and redemption, many of them donated to the prison library by religious organizations. But it was during the week before Thanksgiving that Marcus had his breakthrough moment. While walking past the prison chapel, a small multi-faith space that he had never entered in 7 years of incarceration, he overheard a conversation between 2 inmates about the upcoming holidays. "My kid's gonna be 8 on Christmas Day," one man was saying, his voice heavy with regret. "I ain't been there for a single birthday since he turned 3. His mama sends pictures, but he don't even ask about me no more." The other inmate nodded in recognition. "Yeah, man, holidays are the worst. All these kids out there growing up thinking their daddies just disappeared, don't care about them, and we're in here feeling sorry for ourselves, can't do nothing about it. If this story truly touches your heart, Let's speak for you. Like this video, subscribe to be part of our journey, and share your feelings in the comments. The conversation crystallized something that had been forming in Marcus's mind for weeks. The men in cell block D weren't just dangerous criminals. They were also fathers, sons, and brothers who had been separated from their families by their own poor choices. Many of them carried the same guilt and regret that had been eating away at Marcus since his conviction. What if there was a way to help these men reconnect with their humanity, even within the constraint of prison? What if the Christmas season could become an opportunity for healing and growth instead of just another reminder of everything they had lost? That evening, Marcus approached his cellmate, a 50-year-old lifer named Robert Washington, who had been incarcerated for 23 years for a murder committed during a robbery when he was barely out of his teens. Robert was one of the most respected men in cell block D, intelligent, well-read, and possessed of the kind of quiet authority that came from years of navigating prison politics successfully. "Bobby," Marcus said, settling onto his bunk as Robert looked up from the legal brief he was reviewing for another inmate. "What do you know about Christmas in here?" Robert raised an eyebrow at the unexpected question. "What you mean, what do I know? Ain't no Christmas in prison, brother. Just another day to get through, maybe with slightly worse food and more depression than usual. Why you asking?" Marcus outlined the idea that had been forming in his mind. What if they could create a real Christmas celebration in cell block D? Not just a meal or a television program, but something that would allow the men to connect with their families, express their love for their children, and remember who they had been before their crimes defined them. "You talking about some kind of holiday program?" Robert asked, his tone skeptical. "Man, the administration don't care about no feel-good activities. These guards see us as animals in cages, not people who deserve Christmas." But as Marcus continued explaining his vision, Robert's expression began to change. Marcus wasn't talking about asking the administration for special privileges or resources. He was proposing that the inmates create something meaningful themselves, using only what they could legally acquire or make within existing prison rules. "I'm talking about making gifts," Marcus said. "Real gifts made by hand that we can give to our kids during visiting days. I'm talking about teaching guys how to write letters to their families, how to apologize for what they've done, how to show love even from behind bars." Robert was quiet for several minutes, considering the proposal. As someone who had been incarcerated since before some of his fellow inmates were born, he had seen countless programs and initiatives come and go. Most failed because they relied on outside support that eventually dried up, or because they couldn't overcome the institutional resistance of both guards and inmates who were suspicious of anything that deviated from established routines. But Marcus's idea was different because it was completely self-contained and focused on the most powerful motivator available to most inmates: their relationships with their children and families. Every man in cell block D had people on the outside who had been hurt by their crimes and their absence. The opportunity to do something positive for those people might be powerful enough to overcome the cynicism and hostility that characterized daily life in the prison. "All right," Robert said finally, "I'm listening. But you gotta understand, most of these guys ain't gonna be interested in no arts and crafts project. You're talking about hard men who gotta maintain their reputations to survive in here." Marcus had anticipated this objection. "That's why we start small. We don't announce nothing. Don't make no big deal about it. We just start working on our own projects. And when guys ask what we're doing, we explain it. Let them decide if they want to be part of it." Over the next week, Marcus and Robert quietly began their Christmas project. They started by making lists of the children and family members they want to create gifts for. Marcus had Keisha, now 15, and preparing for her sophomore year of high school, while Robert had 2 grandchildren he had never met and a son who rarely visited. The first challenge was acquiring materials. The prison commissary sold basic school supplies, but at inflated prices that made them unaffordable for most inmates who earned between 20 and 40 cents per hour for prison jobs. Marcus and Robert began trading their own commissary purchases, giving up snacks, personal hygiene items, and other small luxuries to accumulate the paper, pencils, and basic crafting supplies they needed. They also had to work within strict security regulations that prohibited many common crafting materials. Metal items, sharp objects, and anything that could be used as a weapon were forbidden. Even seemingly innocent materials like glue or paint were controlled substances that required special permission to possess. But Marcus discovered that creativity thrived under constraints. Using techniques learned from other inmates who had mastered the art of creating useful items from prison-approved materials, he began developing methods for creating meaningful gifts that would pass security inspections while still expressing genuine love and effort. His first project was a hand-drawn storybook for Keisha, inspired by memories of the bedtime stories he used to create for her when she was small. Using colored pencils and notebook paper, Marcus began illustrating and writing a story about a young girl who overcame challenges through courage and determination, a thinly veiled allegory for Keisha's battle with cancer and her strength during his absence. Robert chose to create a family tree for his son, meticulously researching their genealogy through letters to relatives and creating a detailed chart that showed 3 generations of family history. His goal was to help his son understand their family story beyond the crime that had defined Robert's legacy. Word of their project spread slowly through Cell Block D, carried by the informal communication networks that exist in every prison. At first, the reaction was mostly skeptical amusement. Hardened criminals making Christmas crafts seemed like a contradiction in terms to men who had learned to suppress emotional vulnerability as a survival mechanism. But as other inmates saw the care and skill that Marcus and Robert were putting into their gifts, curiosity began to replace mockery. A few men approached them privately, asking questions about techniques or materials. Some shared stories about their own children and the guilt they carried about missing important moments in their kids' lives. Tony Rodriguez, a 35-year-old serving 8 years for drug distribution, was the third person to join what was becoming known quietly as the Christmas Project. Tony had a 4-year-old daughter named Isabella, who had been born just months before his arrest. She barely knew him, and her mother had recently begun bringing her for monthly visits that were both precious and heartbreaking for Tony. "I want to make her something she can keep," Tony told Marcus during one of their conversations in the prison workshop, where inmates could work on approved projects during their free time. "Something that shows her daddy loves her, even though he can't be there to tuck her in at night." Tony's project became a wooden toy chest that he built using scrap wood from the workshop and decorated with hand-painted flowers and butterflies. The chest took him 6 weeks to complete, working on it during every available moment of free time and trading commissary items for the paint and brushes needed to create the colorful design. As word of the Christmas Project spread, the character of Cell Block D began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. Conversations in the common areas shifted from the usual topics: complaint about guards, prison politics, and plans for retaliation against perceived slights, to discussions about children, families, and memories of better times. Men who had barely spoken to each other began collaborating on projects, sharing skills and materials. James Miller, a quiet man serving 12 years for burglary, taught others how to create intricate paper sculptures using techniques he had learned in art therapy programs. Carlos Vega, incarcerated for assault, shared his knowledge of woodworking gained from years of prison shop assignments. The Christmas Project also began to change how the participants saw themselves and each other. Instead of being defined solely by their crimes and institutional roles, they were rediscovering their identities as fathers, brothers, and sons. The creative process of making gifts for their loved ones reconnected them with parts of themselves that had been suppressed or forgotten during their years behind bars. Officer Sarah Martinez was the first guard to notice the change. As a 5-year veteran of the correctional system, she had learned to recognize the subtle shifts in mood and behavior that could signal either trouble or positive developments in her assigned cell block. What she observed in December 2019 was unlike anything she had seen during her career. The noise level was different, Officer Martinez later explained to her supervisors. These men were still serving the same sentences, still dealing with the same institutional constraints, but there was less anger in their voices, fewer arguments, more cooperation during routine activities like meals and recreation time. The transformation became even more apparent during the second week of December, when several inmates approached Officer Martinez with an unusual request. They wanted permission to organize a Christmas celebration in the common area of Cell Block D. Not a party, but an opportunity for men who had completed gifts for their families to display their work and share their stories. Prison regulations required any organized inmate activity to be approved through multiple levels of administration, a process that typically took weeks or months. But Officer Martinez was intrigued by what she had observed and decided to advocate for the inmates' proposal to her supervisors. These men aren't asking for special privileges or additional resources, she argued during a staff meeting. They're asking for permission to share something they created themselves, something positive that connects them with their families. The worst that could happen is it doesn't work out. The best that could happen is we discover a new approach to rehabilitation that actually makes a difference. Warden Patricia Collins had been running Riverside State Penitentiary for 8 years, and she had seen enough failed rehabilitation programs to be skeptical of inmate-initiated activities. But she was also pragmatic enough to recognize that Cell Block D had been experiencing unusually low levels of violence and disciplinary incidents during December, a time of year that typically saw increased tensions due to holiday-related depression and frustration. After consulting with her security staff and reviewing the specific details of the inmate's proposal, Warden Collins approved a limited Christmas celebration for December 23rd, with strict conditions: no outside visitors, no additional resources provided by the prison, and immediate cancellation if any security concerns arose. The approval of their Christmas celebration energized the participants and attracted additional inmates who had been watching the project from a distance. By December 20th, over 40 men in Cell Block D were involved in some aspect of the Christmas initiative, either creating their own gifts or helping others with their projects. The diversity of the gifts reflected the creativity and resourcefulness that emerged when men who had been defined by their worst decisions were given an opportunity to express their best impulses. There were handwritten cookbooks containing family recipes passed down through generations, carved chess sets made from soap bars, intricate drawings and paintings created with colored pencils and improvised paints, and dozens of letters expressing love, regret, and hope for the future. But the most powerful aspect of the Christmas project wasn't the gift themselves. It was the transformation it had created in the men who made them. Marcus watched as men who had barely spoken to their families in years began writing heartfelt letters of apology and reconciliation. He saw former enemies collaborating on projects and sharing materials. Most importantly, he witnessed hardened criminals rediscovering their capacity for love, creativity, and selflessness. The night before the Christmas celebration, Marcus lay in his bunk reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 7 years earlier, he had entered Riverside State Penitentiary as a broken man consumed by anger, desperation, and self-pity. He had expected to serve his time in emotional isolation, counting down the days until release while building the psychological walls necessary to survive in a hostile environment. Instead, he had discovered that even in the most unlikely circumstances, it was possible to create meaning, build community, and contribute to something larger than individual survival. The Christmas project had given him a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life long before his incarceration, a feeling that his actions could make a positive difference in the world. The celebration itself took place in the common area of Cell Block D on December 23rd, attended by 47 inmates, 6 correctional officers, and Warden Collins herself, who had decided to observe the event personally. The room had been transformed by decorations made entirely from approved materials: paper snowflakes created from notebook pages, garlands fashioned from colored construction paper, and a Christmas tree constructed from stacked wooden crates and decorated with ornaments made from various crafted materials. But the real magic of the evening came when the inmates began sharing their gifts and the stories behind them. Each man who had created something for his family was invited to display his work and explain its significance to the group. What followed was an extraordinary display of vulnerability, creativity, and love that moved everyone present. Marcus presented his illustrated storybook for Keisha, reading excerpts from the tale of the brave young girl who overcame obstacles through determination and courage. As he read, his voice caught with emotion as he described how the fictional character's journey paralleled his daughter's real-life battle with cancer and his hopes for her future. Robert displayed his meticulously researched family tree, explaining how the project had helped him reconnect with relatives he hadn't spoken to in decades and given him new insights into family history he wanted to share with his son. The tree included photographs that relatives had sent, creating a visual representation of the connections that transcended the prison walls. Tony showed off the wooden toy chest he had created for his 4-year-old daughter Isabella, describing how he had imagined her using it to store her favorite toys and how he hoped it would remind her that her father loved her even when he couldn't be there to play with her. Story after story followed, each one revealing the complex humanity of men who were rarely seen as anything other than their criminal records. There were gifts for sons and daughters, grandchildren and siblings, mothers and wives who had stood by their loved ones despite the pain and embarrassment of their crimes. But the most powerful moment of the evening came when James Miller, the quiet man who had taught paper sculpture techniques to other inmates, presented a gift intended not for his own family, but for the family of his crime victim. Using techniques that had taken him months to master, James had created an intricate paper memorial dedicated to the memory of the elderly woman who had died during the burglary that led to his conviction. "I can't bring her back," James said, his voice barely audible in the quiet common room. "I can't undo what I did, and I can't take away the pain I caused her family. But I can honor her memory and spend every day of the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the second chance I've been given." The memorial was accompanied by a letter James had written to the victim's family, expressing his remorse and describing the changes he had made during his incarceration. He didn't know if the family would ever want to receive his letter or his memorial, but creating them had been an important part of his own healing process. As the evening continued, it became clear that something unprecedented was happening in Cell Block D. Men who had spent years hardened by the dehumanizing aspects of incarceration were rediscovering their capacity for empathy, creativity, and moral growth. The Christmas celebration had become a community expression of redemption, not perfect or complete, but genuine and transformative. Officer Martinez later wrote in her report that the atmosphere in the common room that night was unlike anything she had experienced in her corrections career. These men weren't performing for the administration or trying to manipulate the system for personal advantage, she observed. They were sharing genuine emotions and authentic expressions of love for their families. It was the most human interaction I had ever witnessed in a prison setting. Warden Collins was equally impressed by what she observed. As someone who had dedicated her career to corrections, she had always believed that rehabilitation was possible, but she had rarely seen such clear evidence of actual transformation occurring within her facility. "What struck me most," she later told reporters who covered the story, "was the organic nature of this program. It wasn't imposed by the administration or developed by outside consultants. It emerged from the inmates themselves, driven by their desire to reconnect with their families and express their better angels despite their circumstances." The success of the Christmas celebration led to immediate changes in Cell Block D and eventually throughout Riverside State Penitentiary. The administration implemented new policies that allowed for regular family-focused activities and expanded access to arts and craft materials for inmates who demonstrated positive behavior. More importantly, the Christmas project created a cultural shift that extended far beyond the holiday season. The men who had participated began mentoring newer inmates, sharing the lessons they had learned about channeling guilt and regret into positive action. They established ongoing programs focused on parenting skills, family communication, and creative expression. Marcus became a leader in these expanded rehabilitation efforts, using his experience organizing the Christmas Project to develop programs that helped other inmates reconnect with their families and plan for successful reentry into society. He earned his GED while incarcerated and began taking college courses through a correspondence program, preparing for a future career in social work focused on helping ex-offenders rebuild their lives. The ripple effects of the Christmas Project extended beyond the prison walls as well. Families of participating inmates reported improved relationships and more meaningful communication during visits and phone calls. Children began to see their incarcerated fathers not just as criminals who had abandoned them, but as complex human beings who were working to become better people. Keisha Johnson, now a high school senior, wrote her own letter to her father describing the impact of receiving his illustrated storybook. "When you gave me that book you made in prison, I finally understood that even though you made a terrible mistake, you're still my dad who loves me and wants the best of me," she wrote. "It made me want to be strong like the girl in your story, and it made me proud that you're working so hard to be the man you want to be when you come home." The story of Marcus Johnson and the Christmas Project at Riverside State Penitentiary attracted national attention when a documentary filmmaker learned about the program through a corrections officer who had witnessed the transformation firsthand. The resulting film, Christmas Behind Bars, premiered at several film festivals and was eventually broadcast on national television. The documentary brought attention to broader questions about prison reform, rehabilitation, and the possibility of redemption for people who had committed serious crimes. It sparked conversations about the role of creativity, family connection, and community building in helping incarcerated individuals develop the skills and attitudes necessary for successful reentry into society. But for Marcus, the most meaningful outcome of the Christmas Project wasn't the national recognition or the policy changes it inspired. It was a personal transformation he had experienced and witnessed in his fellow inmates. The discovery that even in the most constrained and dehumanizing circumstances, it was possible to choose love over hate, hope over despair, and service over selfishness. 5 years after that first Christmas celebration in Cell Block D, Marcus was released from Riverside State Penitentiary after serving 12 years of his 15-year sentence, with time reduced for good behavior and participation in rehabilitation programs. He had used his remaining years of incarceration to earn a bachelor's degree in social work and to develop a comprehensive reentry plan that included housing, employment, and continued education. Upon his release, Marcus was hired by a nonprofit organization that provides services to ex-offenders, and he began working directly with men and women transitioning from incarceration back to their communities. He specialized in helping former inmates rebuild relationships with their families and develop the life skills necessary for long-term success. If you made it all the way here, it means this story truly held you. So don't leave without showing some love. Hit like, subscribe to stay with us, and drop a comment. I'll be here, reading every word you share. The Christmas tradition he had started continued at Riverside State Penitentiary and had been adopted by correctional facilities in 12 other states. What had begun as one man's effort to create something meaningful for his daughter had become a model for how incarcerated individuals could maintain family connections and work toward personal redemption. On Christmas Eve 2024, Marcus sat in his small apartment surrounded by his own family. Keisha, now a college graduate working as a pediatric nurse, her husband, and their infant son Marcus Jr., named in honor of the grandfather who had found his way back to them. The apartment was decorated with ornaments and gifts, but the centerpiece of their celebration was the original illustrated storybook Marcus had created for Keisha during his incarceration, now carefully preserved as a family heirloom. As Marcus looked at his grandson sleeping peacefully in his daughter's arms, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The crime that had sent him to prison had been the worst mistake of his life, causing immeasurable pain to his victims and his family. But the years that followed had taught him that mistakes, even terrible ones, don't have to define the rest of a person's life. The man who robbed that store 15 years ago was desperate and broken. Marcus told a group of formerly incarcerated individuals he was mentoring. But the man who started making Christmas gifts in Cell Block D had begun to remember that he was more than his worst decision. And the man sitting here today knows that redemption is always possible, even in the darkest places, as long as we choose to serve something bigger than ourselves. The prisoner who had changed Christmas forever behind bars had discovered that the true miracle of the season wasn't found in the gift themselves, but in the transformation that occurred when people choose to express love instead of surrendering to despair. His story became a testament to the possibility that even in the most unlikely circumstances, the human capacity for growth, compassion, and redemption could overcome the forces of hatred, hopelessness, and institutional dehumanization. Marcus Johnson's legacy lived on not just in the programs he had inspired or the policies he had influenced, but in the countless families who had been reunited, the children who had learned to forgive their incarcerated parents, and the former inmates who had discovered that their past mistakes didn't have to determine their future possibilities. The Christmas miracle he had created in Cell Block D had proven that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with the smallest acts of love, and that the capacity for transformation exists even in the hearts of those whom society has written off as irredeemable. In choosing to make gifts to their families, the men of Riverside State Penitentiary had given themselves the greatest gift of all, the rediscovery of their own humanity.